Back. All right. Today, wow, Stephen, the Bellagio firing off. Is that what we got in the background there?
Yeah,
Um,
that's the thing about being live. I'm here at the DevOps Enterprise Summit where we're launching the report. So,
yeah, Stephen's live in Las Vegas at Does, and I'm back here in New Hampshire at Fox headquarters here. So today we launched the ninth annual State of the Software Supply Chain report. Each year we try to continue a few things that we've looked at in the past to see how trends continue over the years, and also we try to take a new and novel look at the data each year to explore new aspects of what's going on in the ecosystem. I know it's well loved for these types of insights. So, Stephen, you've been pretty instrumental in doing the research this year. What's top of mind for you?
yeah, sure. And sometimes we have new data each year as well, and so that happened again this year. We had took a look at the OpenSSF scorecard data, which we've done in the past. We did that last year to identify the DevSecOps practices that had the greatest impact on vulnerability. This year, we did more of a survey of those practices broadly speaking across the open source community. And a couple of things that were interesting and surprising. One was if you look at the set of maintained projects, like how many projects out there are maintained, um, it's it's only 11%, which sort of matches what you might expect, right? Most of the effort goes into a few projects that are widely used. But then looking at those projects and what practices they're implementing, I was surprised to see how little code review there is going on. The majority of those projects don't qualify as doing code review according to those checks, and so definite room for improvement there on the production side. But then we also looked at the consumption side as well. You want to talk about vulnerability and avoidable vulnerability?
Yeah, but before we get to that unmaintained thing, I mean, even to me that seems shocking. How do we calculate that? Or we use the scorecard calculation. How is that calculated?
Yeah, so that takes a look at the project to see how active it is. So there need to have been regular contributions over the last 90 days. I think the threshold is like one code change per week, something like that. I'd have to look at the details, but it's regular updates to the code uh, or responding to issues. That counts as activity as well. And so to fall below that maintained threshold, you really have to have basically inactivity.
No activity, no commits, no issues, nothing like that for 3 months. Yeah, that's borderline inactive, I suppose. So yeah, that's kind of a shocking number. The one that I was talking about a lot from last year's report seems to be unfortunately unchanged. Right, that we looked at when something that is known to be vulnerable is being consumed from Maven Central. 96% of the time there is already a fix available, which means only 4% of these problems are actually unavoidable on the consumption side, and that's just a shocking statistic, and it's really frustrating that it's largely unchanged in the last year. Although I'm somewhat not surprised. I mean, I would have expected maybe a tick down a little bit, but not massive change. And when we talk a lot about the same statistic for Log4j, we're closing in on what about 22 months now post Log4j, and I looked when I was speaking at a conference just 2 weeks ago. 25% of the downloads of Log4j are of these known vulnerable versions 22 months later, right? So those are unavoidable. Those are in that 96%, and that's shocking and frustrating. But I think it highlights a big part of the problem. I don't know, Stephen. What do you think?
Yeah. I think there's almost a larger than expected segment of the open source ecosystem that's sort of stagnant, right? They're pulling down, or it's maybe not all open source, but with Log4j, there's these stagnant projects that are continuing to pull down vulnerable versions. With the unmaintained projects, there's this significant swath of the ecosystem that's sort of just sitting there. Um,
Yeah, so that kind of leads into the next one that we think we already know the answer, but we surveyed organizations last year, right, and we did it again this year to get a sense of how many people felt like they had things under control. So why don't you talk about that number?
67% of respondents that their applications don't rely on known vulnerable downloads. Of course, that's sort of at odds with the numbers that we see with things like Log4j and all the vulnerable downloads that are occurring. And actually, it's at odds with another question in the survey, which was about breaches due to open source vulnerabilities. And so 10% of respondents had a breach due to an open source vulnerability in the last 12 months, which I think is pretty incredible and notable.
Yeah. And this looks like a new statistic. I don't recall this from last year that the awareness and mitigation of open source in some organizations, 36% say that it takes over a week to mitigate vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and that's surprising because we did see increases year over year in the number of people incorporating dependency analysis tools into their CI pipeline. So, adoption of the tools is increasing. Hopefully we'll see that response time come down as more automation gets built into pipelines. And I think that's going to be necessary too with some of the new regulations that are coming, and the requirement that people start producing SBOM. Do you want to talk about what people should prepare for there?
I wish I knew, honestly. I think on the U.S. side, of course, a couple of years ago, we had the executive order pushing on SBOMs. In the last probably 16 months or so, we've seen CISA really step up and be much more active in working with the open source community and helping to shape some of the policies that are coming forward. And they recently, through ONCD, released a request for feedback based on CISA's roadmap, and there are a number of interesting things in there. But notably, the approach recognizes that the people that need to take responsibility are the organizations that are using open source and putting it into their products and then selling it. And as we said, with this 96% number and 25% of Log4j, those are organizations that are putting that stuff into software. The U.S. approach has largely been to recognize that it's those organizations that need to make the change here, that trying to penalize open source maintainers won't work because a lot of it is hobbyist. Although there's a stat there that I want to come back to in a minute. But we've seen some legislation that's pending in Europe that is intentionally trying to shift the responsibility onto open source maintainers, with potential, tens of million euro fines for not compliance. And I don't know how you force that on people that are doing things for the good of everybody in their spare time. I guess they'll find a different hobby, and or maybe not allow their stuff to be used in Europe. So it's very, very interesting to see the dichotomy in the approaches between the US and Europe. And I've done a lot of writing and speaking on this over the last year. So, I hope that cooler heads will prevail. But it's not a slam dunk, and so there is a tendency in some places to overreact on the legislation. In terms of like the hobbyist versus not hobbyist, one of the surprising things that I saw in the report this year was the number that showed that during COVID, actually the number of, was it new projects, actually slowed, and we're
Yeah,
seeing it pick back up.
decrease.
Want to add more to that?
Yeah, that was really interesting to see that slow down. During the pandemic, everyone sort of had more time on their hands, at least in many cases. But we didn't see an increase in, hobby projects, open source projects being released. In fact, it took a significant dip. And dug deeper to see what might be behind that. One hypothesis is it's a reflection of the huge increase in commercial involvement in open source. There's a lot of open source contributions now, even new projects, that originate as, a commercially supported project. And in fact, we've seen some of that, as AI has taken off, right? OpenAI's libraries, those are sort of certainly near the top in terms of usage. But we have seen that innovation reoccur. So it's coming back. And I think, that was sort of, one takeaway for me from looking at all the data in this year's report was just the increase in innovation, right? We have more projects more open source projects being contributed. We have all the information with large language models, all the uptake, of those AI libraries, and we've really seen industry respond to those the availability of those new components.
Yeah, yeah. I thought there was a mistake in the data when I was reading that early draft. Like, how is that possible that during COVID, the number of open source projects decreased, and yet the data was pretty much irrefutable? And after I scratched my head for a while, the only conclusion I could come to was that, yeah, this is actually evidence that a lot of open source is supported and maintained by commercial contributions. I mean, many of us know that, even though it gets this. Um, this reputation that it's just amateurs and hobbyists. I think the data bears out that that's actually not the case. Certainly, if somebody has another theory behind why that would have happened, I'd love to hear it, because I literally can't think of any other reason.
Yeah.
People had more time than ever. Because there was nothing else to do. You would think that's the perfect time to sit and hack on your favorite open source project or create new ones, and yet it seems like that didn't happen. So,
Yeah,
um,
another interesting thing on the maintained open source project front, we looked at last year versus this year and how many projects qualified as maintained, and that number has actually gone down, which was surprising to me. There were about a little over 11,000 project decrease in the number of maintained projects, which, you know, again, like open source is growing, there's more downloads than ever, but sort of fewer maintained projects, which was non-intuitive at first. But, I think it might just be the system working, right? Those projects that are having impact and value, people are swarming around them, and maybe it's just a coalescing of effort around where, value is concentrated.
Yeah, and so we're just about at time here. So one last thing. I know we spent some time looking at, I think the title of your talk, I think it's tomorrow, is stop wasting developers' time. We did some analysis on that. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So, maintaining dependencies, keeping on top of open source risk, it's a lot of effort. So on average, a Java project in industry has 150 dependencies, and each of those releases on average 10 times per year. So that's 1,500 updates you potentially have to consider per application as you're maintaining your software over time. And so we looked at those updates, how can you be more efficient in your approach to that? And sort of categorized updates as wasted effort or not, right? So what's wasted effort? It's like you updated to a version that you didn't need to. There wasn't a vulnerability associated with the old version. Or you update to an intermediate version and then immediately update to a newer version. You're sort of doing more updates than you need to, rather than just sort of jumping ahead, right? So that accounts. You add that up, and that accounts for about 3 weeks of wasted work per team per year. We found that last year. This year, we took a look at the role that software composition analysis tooling can play in helping you manage that process, right? So that's a primary source of update work, right? You find out a vulnerability applies to some component, and now you have to update that component. Well, false positives mean that if you have a high false positive rate from your tool, that may or may not actually be a vulnerability that applies to you, right? And so we looked at the impact of that, and it turns out that if you can decrease false positive rate by 25%, you'll save another 3 weeks of developer effort. So if you can use a tool that has a low false positive rate, and you can make optimal decisions as you're doing your normal updating, moving to newer versions, maybe for features or bug fixes, you can all told save a month and a half of developer time per year per team, which is significant. I mean, think about what you could do with another month and a half of dev weeks.
I could find some things for sure. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap it up here. If you're on site at DevOps Enterprise Summit, come see Steven's talk tomorrow at what time?
That's a great question.
Tomorrow, find it on the agenda. If you're not, or even if you are, take a look at the latest report. It's at sonatype.com/SSCR for State of the Software Supply Chain Report. And once you go through that and you are shocked and horrified by what you see in there, and then you start to reflect on what's going on within your own organization, we, of course, don't just do research for the sake of the research. This drives our product innovation, our platform. We have solutions for all of these things. So go read the report, get scared, and then let's talk about how we can help you make it better. And so with that, thanks for tuning in. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.